Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to this webinar on the use of social media by children and adolescents in East Asia, opportunities, risks, and harms. This is featuring one of UNICEF's Best of UNICEF Research and Evaluation 2020 research winners. My name is Kerry Albright. I'm Chief of Research Facilitation and Knowledge Management at UNICEF's Office of Research in Innocenti in Italy, and I'm one of your hosts for today. It's a pleasure to introduce you to our speakers today. We have several speakers, so in the interests of time, I'm just going to introduce them briefly and we will place the rest of their bios in the chat as we go along. So our first speaker today is Rachel Harvey. She's the UNICEF Regional Advisor on Child Protection at the East Asia and Pacific Regional Office based in Thailand. Our second speaker is Patrick Burton. He's the CEO and Executive Director of the Centre for Justice and Crime Prevention based in South Africa. Our third speaker is Monica Bulger. She's a Senior Fellow at the Joan Gans Cooney Centre at Sesame Workshop based in the USA. We also have with us Emma Day, who's an online child protection consultant, also at UNICEF East Asia Pacific Regional Office. She's not presenting today, but she's one of the research managers. As discussants, we have Daniel Kardefelt-Winter, who is a research specialist on children and digital technologies, also based alongside me at the UNICEF Office of Research in Italy. We have Ms. Hashima Hashim, who is the head of the Community Engagement Department in the Strategic Communications and Industry Relations Division of the Malaysian Communications and Multimedia Commission. And finally, we have Catherine Anila, who's a child rights youth advocate and founder of Vanguards for Change. Before we get started on the main webinar, we just wanted to show you a short video to give you a flavor of this winning research. Chris, over to you.
Despite the prevalence of internet use by children and adolescents in East Asia, little is known about how they engage with online technology and their understanding of risks. Understanding how children interact with social media, their perceptions of risk, and the steps they take to mitigate these risks is essential to developing effective strategies to prevent and respond to online child sexual abuse and exploitation.
One of the strengths of our research is that we spoke with 301 youth who are not normally spoken with for this type of work. And that includes children with disabilities, children in incarceration, children exploited in prostitution, and refugee children. They were very brave in sharing their hopes for what could be changed on the internet for themselves and also for others. Mostly the internet is a very positive experience for children. They spoke about learning from it, whether that was for their schoolwork, learning a new language, learning crafts, learning music, learning new skills, and also sharing their knowledge with other people.
So when it comes to risks and harms, we found that around 2/3 of children had experienced some form of online violence or upsetting experience over the previous year. These ranges from cyberbullying to sexual exploitation. I think what was worrying for us is that 2 out of 5 had experiences online that they didn't want to tell anybody about.
Having these insights on children's use of social media and perceptions of risk have been invaluable for our advocacy and programming on child online protection in the region. We've used the findings in our advocacy and technical support with governments, including for the development of the Regional Plan of Action, the implementation of the 2019 ASEAN Declaration on Child Online Protection, and the research is now contributing to our groundbreaking regional initiative with ICT companies to build the evidence base of what works to reduce risky behaviour and promote protective behaviours through online safety education and messaging.
Thank you. So that gives you just a small insight, and we'll hear more obviously from the presenters in due course. So first of all, just a little bit of background about the Best of UNICEF Research and Evaluation competition. For the past 8 years, the Office of Research in Innocenti has invited UNICEF colleagues around the world, including country offices, regional offices, national committees, and headquarters, to submit their best and most recent examples of quality research for children. The aim is to promote research best practices to identify where they may be scaled up, and to reward quality studies with a high potential for impact on policies and programs that benefit children. In 2020, UNICEF Innocenti and the Evaluation Office joined forces to produce a single report, the Best of UNICEF Research and Evaluation 2020, which collected quality research and evaluations from 2 ongoing UNICEF exercises, the Best of UNICEF Research and Most Influential Evaluations. In the current global political climate, evidence, facts, and objective assessment are needed more than ever to help enhance the rights and well-being of the world's children, and to ensure that we achieve maximum value for money for children with every UNICEF dollar spent. Researching the changing world around us and evaluating progress towards a better world are 2 sides of the same coin, both critical to reimagining the future. The BOR webinars aim to jointly promote the 2020 winners and to enhance the visibility and uptake of their work, both within UNICEF and externally. The 3 2020 research winners were all deemed outstanding in terms of highlighting structural discrimination and violence against children and adopting a rights-based approach whilst giving voice to children and communities. They were also exemplary in engaging local institutions in the research, allowing for ownership, policy, and program impact. So today, we award and feature the winning research from the UNICEF East Asia and Pacific Regional Office, which in 2019 led this pioneering study with the Center for Justice and Crime Prevention to plug gaps in the understanding of online behavioral patterns of children in East Asia, particularly in Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand. Despite the prevalence of internet use by children and adolescents in East Asia, little is still known about how they engage with online technology or their understanding of risks. A primary goal of this work was to interview children usually excluded from this type of research. Reviewers particularly commended its focus on hard-to-reach children, not usually covered in studies on the use of social media, such as lower-income families, street children and refugee children, and also recommended it for its child-centered perspective, giving voices to children and providing them with appropriate mechanisms to share their experiences. The methodology included innovative focus group discussions conducted by youth leaders, one of whom you'll hear from today. Understanding how children interact with social media, their perception of risk, and the steps they take to mitigate online risks is essential to the development of effective strategies to prevent and address online sexual abuse and exploitation. This piece of research examined such risks, but also looked at how to balance these opportunities for children in an online environment. And in so doing, reviewers commended its nuanced presentation of findings and trade-offs to change how we understand the issue of social media in a child's life. In the context of COVID-19 and the expansion of online experiences for children worldwide, the study was considered by reviewers to have significant potential for policy impact. Already, the research findings are contributing to a major new regional initiative to understand what works for messaging and educational materials to help children in East Asia protect themselves online. It therefore gives me great pleasure to be able to virtually hand over this award certificate to members of the research team. These will, of course, be coming in the post to you in reality, but I'd like to give them and hand them over virtually to Rachel Harvey from IAPRO and Emma, and also to Patrick and Monica. And now I'd like to invite Rachel to say a few words on behalf of the whole research team.
Thank you so much, Kerry. So on behalf of the East Asia Pacific Regional Office, but also the UNICEF country offices from Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, and the research team, we're really thrilled to be receiving the BOR Awards. We're really proud of this research. And we want to thank everyone who took the time to be part of the study. In particular, it would not have been possible without the 301 children and young people who agreed to take part and share their experiences and their views so openly. I also want to thank the wonderful youth facilitators for supporting the consultations in the 4 countries. You'll be hearing from one of them today, Catherine, who led the consultations in Malaysia. We're also really grateful for the support of the NGOs, especially Childline, and government counterparts and frontline workers who created those opportunities for the team to meet the young people, including, as Kerry said, from children whose perspective we would not normally hear in this type of research. This research was also a collaboration with our UNICEF country office colleagues in Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, There are too many individuals to mention, but a big thanks to each of them. And also to Emma, who managed this research and steered this research so expertly from start to finish. And of course, I want to recognize the really fantastic work of Patrick and Monica, and especially for ensuring that the views, experiences, and recommendations gathered from children and young people were not just turned into numbers or summaries. You really treated their reflections with care and made sure that their words and stories were captured in a way that was engaging, but also provided a real insight into a world that we struggle to truly appreciate as adults, especially having grown up without the internet. And that's why I think this is a really powerful and invaluable piece of research for informing our programming, our policy, and our strategy development for child online protection. So thank you, Monica and Patrick. And a big thanks to the End Violence Fund for financing this research. And last but certainly not least, for the board team for not only recognising the value of children's voices in this research, but also helping us to share their views as widely as possible to create a safer online world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel. Fantastic. And congratulations once again to the team for a very worthy winning piece of research. So now, without further ado, I'd like to hand you over back to Rachel, Patrick, and Monica to give you a short presentation about the research in their own words rather than mine. Please do start submitting your questions via Q&A. And after the presentation, I'll hand you straight over to my colleague, Daniel, my co-host, who will kick off our discussion. Thank you. Over to you, Rachel.
Thanks once again, Kerry. And in fact, I'm not going to take much time because I really want to give Monica and Patrick as much time as possible to share their insights from the study. But I do want to emphasize the value of this study in how it shaped our child online protection advocacy and programming in the region. First, the findings really plugged a big gap in our understanding at a moment when there was increasing interest and engagement from governments in the region to take action to make the online world a safer space. We really wanted to make sure that the regional and national frameworks that were being developed and steps being taken were not just informed by our adult assumptions about children's use of social media and what we perceived as risks to them, but we wanted to make sure it was shaped by their experiences, their use of social media, where and how they were spending time online, their opinions about the impact of new technologies on their lives and how they perceived and how they responded to risks and protected themselves. We also wanted to make sure that policymakers as well as UNICEF were considering both the opportunities as well as the risks so that we could avoid inadvertent consequences of measures being taken to safeguard children online. And the action that was being taken was not only on the experiences of the majority of children, but those experiences of the most marginalized, the most at-risk children were also informing the discussions. Concretely, and first, the findings have been immediately useful to inform our programming and advocacy on child online protection in the region, as well as for our 4 country offices, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and Cambodia, who took part in the research. Can we go to the next slide, please? The research also shaped the development and implementation of the regional frameworks here in East Asia. The report was launched by Patrick. You can see him in action on the screen. This is from the ASEAN Regional Conference on Child Online Protection. This conference brought together over 200 multi-sectoral delegates in early 2020, just before COVID hit, to identify actions needed to implement a new regional framework, the declaration that Kerry mentioned on the protection of children from all forms of online exploitation and abuse in ASEAN. It was adopted in 2019. The research findings were really used to inform the discussions. This conference was a kick-start for the development of the regional plan of action, a process which UNICEF continues to support, ensuring that views and experience of young people continue to be considered. Then COVID struck, and the risk for children online increased, and UNICEF with CJCP used the findings to shape key messages, shape guidance for young people and for parents and caregivers on online safety that we published. The findings of the research also informed an initiative that we launched last year. We brought together a regional think tank, ICT actors, academia, UN, NGOs to enhance our collective understanding of what works to reduce risky behaviours and promote positive behaviours of children online through online messaging, through educational tools. And understanding how children use social media, how they perceive risk has really been invaluable to us. And this initiative is going to result in an evaluation framework as a public good, so it will be available to everyone that can be used to assess the impact of online initiatives and build the regional and global evidence base of what works. Lastly, it's inspired us to move beyond only engaging children in research initiatives for child online protection to ensuring their views are informing the implementation of the ASEAN Declaration and Regional Plan of Action. Specifically, we're entering a new regional partnership with an ICT actor to create a platform through which young people from the 10 ASEAN countries can participate in an 18-month program that will empower and equip them to become advocates on child online protection, and will support them to run initiatives at country level to gather and represent the views of even more young people for national processes to enhance online safety. So I'm going to hand over to Monica to talk more about the research. Thank you very much.
Rachel, before I start, we'd like to thank you for your tireless dedication to the protection and empowerment of children in the East Asia region. It's been an honor to work with you, your team, and the incredible UNICEF country offices in Malaysia, Cambodia, Indonesia, and Thailand. Deepest thanks. And deepest thanks also to UNICEF Innocenti for recognition of our research. It's an honor to be included with the important research you've honored by the Best of UNICEF Research and Evaluation Award. Next slide, please. Rachel has provided terrific context and for the need for this work. So I'll start with describing our organizing questions, which we've listed here. So basically, to start, we asked how are students using social media, how are children using social media apps? What risks and benefits do they perceive? How do children seek help when they encounter risks? What is the response? And how has using social media apps changed their lives? What features or changes can improve their experiences? Next slide, please. To accomplish this work, a priority for all of us was to include the voices of children often not heard in discussions of technology use, as Carrie and Rachel have mentioned. We spoke with children who are refugees, children with disabilities, children in incarceration, children living in poverty, and children who are exploited in prostitution. Taking a child-centered approach, we interviewed 301 children aged 11 to 19 across 4 countries, including Malaysia, Cambodia, Indonesia, and Thailand. We spoke with them in hour-long focus groups ranging in size from 3 children to 15. We wanted to deeply understand children's everyday environments, so we interviewed 74 frontline workers, including school counselors, pediatric psychologists, social workers, teachers, principals, parents, and even grandparents. Given the outsized influence of technology in children's lives, we also interviewed local internet service providers, app developers, and large technology platforms. Next slide, please. This will be a familiar face. Catherine Anilla is joining us today. Of particular importance in this work for us was that it was not only be about youth, but with youth. So in each country, we engaged youth facilitators to connect us with hard to reach groups, to interview, and to help in conducting our focus group discussions. Next slide, please. Just very quickly, the apps we found teens were using, most popular were Instagram and Facebook, Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, and they were also using TikTok, oh my goodness, TikTok, Telegram, Line, Spotify, Snapchat. And then they're primarily, next slide, please. Regardless of background, children had access to mobile phones. These phones might be shared amongst family members or hand-me-downs from parents or older siblings. Social media was primarily used for information seeking, communication, and entertainment. The majority of children, regardless of social strata, had received sexual messages or images on social media. Next slide, please. Of particular importance was that most did not consider someone they met online a stranger unless they engaged in creepy behavior. And so steps children take to protect themselves are to have multiple social media accounts, block. Sorry, I was muted for a second. Sorry about that. I'll just repeat quickly. Steps children took to protect themselves were to have multiple social media accounts, to block creepy behavior, and to use fake names and not post profile pictures. Next slide, please. And we can skip that slide, please. The next slide. Thank you. And I will now pass it over to my colleague, Patrick Burton.
Thanks very much, Monica, and you've already expressed thanks to Rachel and to the entire team. So just to reiterate those. So I think, for us, when we approach the recommendations, the one thing that was critical and that emerged from the research, both from the design aspect, but the importance of this that came out throughout the research itself, is just that value and real depth that comes from talking to young people and drawing on young people's voices and children's experiences to shape recommendations as well, and asking them what their advice is and what they think some of the solutions are. And so we've really been able to draw on young people's voices themselves to inform the very recommendations that we're going to talk about now. So we set out 5 sets of recommendations. These were framed against perhaps what we might call one broad recommendation, which is to align the strategies to address online risk for young people with the regional and national strategies and frameworks to address violence against children more broadly. And I think this is particularly important as the intersections between the online and offline in children's lives really came out very strongly throughout the research. Intersections in terms of risks, vulnerabilities, but also some of the sort of strengths and protective factors that are out there. And so, what we try to do was to say, well, let's make sure there's alignment between what countries are doing and what the region's doing to address online violence against children, online risks, and to promote positive use of technology with what's happening in terms of regional and national strategies more broadly to address violence against children. I think it was also a critical time, because it is a critical time to really propose that, because a lot of countries are working now on either developing or updating or revising their strategies on ending violence against children more broadly as part of Pathfinder country initiatives with funders like the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children. And so it's really important that online risks are integrated or at least aligned with those sort of frameworks and strategies. So that was a sort of underlying approach to these recommendations. Following on from that, so we specifically recommended that support be provided for parenting the digital age. And that ranges from support to young teen parents all the way through to elderly caregivers. Monica mentioned that we spoke to elderly caregivers and grandparents, and they're just as critical actors in this. And one of the things we looked at was how technology could even be built into early childhood development programming, from having conversations with new parents or expectant parents around what to expect. Is children being, or are children being on devices necessarily a bad thing at a very young age? What might they think of at a toddler age, going up through childhood? So that's the one aspect of it. And we actually came across a very interesting program in Malaysia that had started to integrate some of these conversations in community dialogues with young parents as part of an early childhood development program. And so one of the recommendations that we took that approach, but also looking at how we can build the digital literacy and skills of parents, caregivers, and elderly caregivers. I think, it's very important that we don't necessarily equate parents' skills to speak to children about what they're doing online, purely with the parent or caregiver's own digital skills and literacy, but rather that's one aspect of it. But we also focus on engaging with parents and caregivers in terms of how simply to support their children online. What might they expect? How do they make decisions about what they might encounter online? And this all kind of speaks to, just to sort of jump down to the third bullet there, about this idea of resilience and how we promote and foster resilience when it comes to children's activities online. Obviously, one way of doing that is to invest in parenting programs and building technology into parenting programs. Touched on that now. But also making sure that we approach resilience as an integrated thing. It's not offline resilience and online resilience. We think of resilience more broadly. And so when we're looking at all of the sort of support structures around children, how do we support things like empathy, good decision making online, supporting them to make the right decisions when they get into difficult situations online, to know what they might expect. And this is all age dependent. And then how do we build technology into those processes? So we're not problematizing children when we're building resilience, but how can we build, or I guess our recommendation was that we look at integrating the use of technology and technology into those very processes that we want to use in order to build resilience. So technology is not the problem. It's just part and parcel of what we need to address when we're looking at fostering children's agility. And so, we made recommendations around parenting and ECD. We made recommendations around resilience. And then we also found it very important that the messaging and the approaches that those working with children and adults are providing and are putting out there are based on evidence and that they're consistent. And so, we came across some examples where, for example, phones were being confiscated from children in schools for up to 6 months or a semester if they'd been using their phones, and that actually disadvantages the child. But also, a lot of children were saying, well, fear messaging versus, more positive messaging. And so I think, and Rachel actually mentioned that we already used some of these recommendations to inform messaging in the context of COVID. And that's really one of the recommendations that we thought should come out strongly, is how do we make sure that people are using what we know works and what the evidence shows works, and as that body of evidence grows, we keep developing that and evolving that messaging. But we really need to make sure that teachers and social workers and care and all of those that work with children in different spheres and domains are using messaging that children connect to, and that is based on what we know works in terms of keeping children safe. As you might have guessed from the previous recommendations, we strongly recommended that interventions, policies, strategies be framed within a broad socio-ecological approach that looked at how risk factors and protective factors interact at an individual level, within the family and the different relationships with caregivers, with friends and peers that exist around the child, looking at the broader societal and community kind of risk factors and how those impact on children and young people. If we can go to the next slide. Our last set of recommendations focused on technology. And we looked at how technology should really be used for safety here. And Monica's already spoken about children's experiences of privacy. Well, she touched on their experiences of privacy and platform safety features, and she made the point that children saw it as their own responsibility to stay safe online, and they took that responsibility upon themselves. And this is something, to deviate quickly, we need to be careful of when we think of resilience, that we're not placing the responsibility for children's safety online on the child in terms of saying, well, it's the child's responsibility to be resilient, but rather it's a broad kind of all the different environments around that and all the different cogs in the wheel that are required to foster that resilience. But it's also technology and the apps and the platforms and the service providers' responsibility. And there's some basic safety mechanisms and settings that we drew attention to that would go a long way towards making platforms and apps safer by default. For example, Facebook could return to a friends-only contact setting instead of forcing profile pics to be shared with everyone in contact open to the public. It would be relatively easy for apps to default to allow photos or images to only be sent to contacts lists or friends. One example is Twitter only allowing private direct messages from connections by default. And then, as you know, WhatsApp is definitely the app to be watched or to be focused on now in terms of figuring out safeguards. Same might be said for TikTok, but much of the conversation is around WhatsApp and how we a lot of the conversations around end-to-end encryption, and we know WhatsApp is almost ubiquitous in the region, almost to the same degree as Facebook Messenger. And that's really, those are the sort of apps and platforms that we should be focusing on in terms of safeguarding children. Yeah, and I'll leave it with that. And brief snapshot. Thank you. I'll hand back to you, Kerry, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Patrick, Monica, Rachel, for the really fantastic overview of your study. Now we're going to move to the next segment of our webinar, where we will have a panel discussion with two invited guests, Ms. Hashima Hashim from the Malaysian Communications and Multimedia Commission, as well as Ms. Catherine Anila, who, as you heard, worked with the research team on the study, who's a child rights advocate who's been working in this space for many years. And this will be followed by a Q&A with the panel and the researchers working on the study, Patrick, Monica, also Rachel. If you have questions about the presentation you just heard, the research itself, or anything you hear in the conversations now with the panelists, please do write the questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to find the time to respond at the end. Just before we go into the panel discussion, let me take a moment to once again congratulate everyone involved in this research. For those of us who have been working on this topic for some time, this report is really a fantastic contribution to the global evidence base. It really is unique. Not only is it a great example of how we can represent children's voices and experiences in research, but it also beautifully contrasts children's experiences with those of adults. And it does so in a way that is respectful of both parties, but it doesn't shy away from highlighting the intergenerational conflicts or tensions that we sometimes see regarding children's use of social media. And I firmly believe that it's only by acknowledging these conflicts and differences in opinions and experiences that we can work to overcome them. And this study really does an excellent job of that, which made me very happy to see. And placing children's voices at the heart of research is something UNICEF has been striving for many years now, as well as providing a balanced picture with respect to risks and opportunities of engaging with digital technology and generating evidence with diverse groups of children within and across countries. And this study does all of that, especially through the use facilitation of focus groups and interviews, which is an amazing way to generate insights and evidence. And I really want to commend our colleagues in the regional office for conceptualizing the study, as well as the researchers for carrying out the fieldwork, and of course the youth facilitators. I was really impressed when I first read this report. And I think one of the most remarkable things really about the study is that it represents marginalized, vulnerable children to a great degree. And as we heard already, this has rarely been done in research on digital technology. In fact, I can't think of many other studies at all, which includes interviews with street children, refugees, as well as exploited children. And these are children we rarely hear from, but whose experiences can really help shed light on the ways in which technology can be helpful for them on the one hand, but is misused to abuse or exploit them on the other. And these insights from exploited children in particular at the emergency center, they were very helpful for my team as we developed the methodology for our new Disrupting Harm project on online child sexual exploitation and abuse, which is being implemented in all 4 countries covered under this study. And being able to draw on experiences of different groups of children in these countries was extremely helpful for us to understand some of the dynamics around how technology can enable or facilitate abuse. And I was very happy that we were able to benefit from the great work done on this study to make our own research more powerful. Now, I'm going to move to the panelists. I'm going to turn first to Ms. Hashima for the first part of our panel discussion. Welcome, Ms. Hashima. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
Absolutely. Oh, it's a pleasure. UNICEF enjoys a strong collaboration with MCMC and the government of Malaysia, who's really involved in research and in evidence generation on this topic. So really, it's fantastic to have you here. I wanted to ask, first of all, I understand that this report was launched at the national level in Malaysia at an event in September last year. What do you consider to be the importance of disseminating a regional study like this, also at the national level?
Well, greetings from MCMC. Thank you, Daniel, and hi, everybody. Hope that you're having a good day today. Well, to your questions, internet is a borderless and fluid world with users all over now sharing similar usage patterns to the extent that it produces some new cultures as the byproduct of internet exposure. So this is evident in the report that children in Southeast Asia countries, including Malaysia, have similar usage pattern and adopt the same strategies seen around the world to protect themselves online. A report such as this on a report such as this one underlines the importance of countries to work together with other stakeholders and be guided with a clear direction in protecting children online. As one of ASEAN countries, Malaysia is fortunate to be part of the ASEAN Declaration to guide us align our child line protection policies and activities with the regional action plan.
Thank you so much for that. And could you talk us through a little bit how you plan to use these research findings from the study to inform policy or inform action? What can you do or what can you understand now by having access to this high quality evidence directly from children?
Well, from these research findings and study, learning from about the current situation with regards to children is important for us, a regulator like MCMC, in trying to understand what works in our programming. It is always tricky to take actions in child protection because it's adults having their way to come up with ways to protect the children. Unfortunately, though having good intentions at heart, without knowing what is going on with the children, the programs might fail miserably. So internet is here to stay, and as a neutral platform where it gives more benefits than harms, we cannot take the privilege from our children. What we have to do is to educate parents to open the communication channel with their children, build their children resiliency online through digital literacy, and trust their children to do the right thing. No amount of parental control softwares can beat this. Apart from parents, MCMC through the Click Dengan Bijak or Click Wisely in English program initiatives relentlessly works on creating awareness and educating the children on online safety and threats. So we continue to do that, and we hope that through the awareness programs and campaign that we have, it will educate our children so that they are more protected online. Thank you.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much, Ms. Hashima, for providing these insights. I'm always, as I said, very impressed with the work of MCMC, and I look forward to future collaboration with you, including on our upcoming Disrupting Harm study. So thank you again for being here.
Yeah, thank you very much. You're welcome. We look forward to be working with all of you too.
Fantastic. I will now turn to Ms. Catherine. Welcome.
Hi Daniel. Hi everyone. Glad to be here today.
It's very good to have you here. So you're a child rights advocate. You've been working to empower young people in their use of digital technology for many years, which I think is amazing. And I'm really happy that you're joining our webinar, that you want to share your experiences, and of course also that you supported us on this research. That's really fantastic. Could I begin by asking you to just talk to us a bit about what you see as the main challenges that young people face online today?
All right, I actually took this question to my Instagram, and as a young person, I had to. So I posted it on my Insta stories. You know how in Instagram there's these interactive tools where you can post questions or have polls. So I asked my followers, I asked them this very question: what do you think is your main challenge online? And the top 3 challenges that were mentioned was addiction or doom scrolling, in another word, where you just keep scrolling and scrolling and you just get distracted on social media. The second one is overconsumption of media, where all the news that you read, whether it's about COVID or it's about violence, everything that you see online it's just overwhelming. And the third one is toxic positivity, where there's so much of peer pressure, and there's the issue of having dual personalities, where someone isn't their true self online. So what I noticed is that all three of these issues are actually related to the mental health of youth themselves.
This is really interesting, and I'm actually struck by what you say about the doom scrolling aspect or the addiction aspect, which has been talked about a lot. But I think the other two issues actually aren't as frequently talked about, and maybe that's something that we need to do a little bit differently when we conduct research, when we work with young people. Thank you so much for that. I think it's amazing that you went to your Instagram account. Moving on, could you talk about some of the most helpful tips that you've shared or would share around young people's online engagement? How can you make it better for young people?
All right, so I think those ones we shared infographics on misinformation and how to filter through before sharing or consuming false information or misinformation, right? Or it can even be fake news. So I think the 3-tier filtering process was that first you identify whether or not it comes from a reliable source, whether it is verified, and then you look at the emotional aspect of it, whether it is pleasant or does it trigger any negative feelings. But then again, you should also know that there are some news that, although it triggers negative feelings, it is important and it needs to be talked about, right? So that is why the 3rd tier for the filtering process is to identify whether or not it is relevant, whether it is necessary for you to share that information, right? So that is one thing. And another thing that I have actually worked on, and I'm proud to say this because UNICEF Malaysia actually created a channel or a platform called Kita Connect, and it is a Telegram channel where one of their activities was to have a teen takeover every weekend. So they would open the platform for anybody, any teenager to use that as a space for them to share whatever they want to share. So along with 2 of my peers, we thought of doing a session on media literacy. And just a highlight from what we shared on that was one of the tips. The tagline for our session was Sure. And is a Malaysian slang where you put it at the end of a question to sort of signal that it is a question. So instead of saying, are you sure? We just say, sure. And it is spelled as AH. So we use that as an acronym to identify for sure. S is for source, so to identify the source. And then U is to understand the message of the content that you share. R is to recognize whether or not it is clickbait. And for E, again, it is emotion, to recognize what you feel when you see that content. And then for A and H, it is basically just whether or not you think you should accept the content or have a look at something else. So I think that was a very interesting tip that we shared.
It's a really interesting way to actually structure a kind of an educational messaging basically around this acronym. I really like it. I think that's very smart. I wonder if we could actually do more things like this when we think about how to do digital literacy programs as UNICEF as well. And then finally, can you tell us a bit about how your involvement in research, like the study we're talking about now, has impacted the direction of your studies and the way you think about your future?
This is going to be hilarious. But
Can't wait.
I am actually in my first year of my sociology and anthropology degree. And believe it or not, the ultimate deciding factor for me to take this degree was this research project. It was
I'm so glad to hear that.
It was when I met Monica and Patrick when they were here for the focus group discussions, when they were conducting the research in Malaysia. It was when I met them that I understood that something as simple as talking to children in the grassroots can actually contribute to the global forum, the global conversation on children's lives online, right? So it made me think how I would like to integrate my passion of child rights advocacy in work. And that is how I got into sociology and anthropology. And I hope someday in the foreseeable future to venture into digital sociology and to do research on that. So you can see in that very sentence how directly it has, how my involvement in all of these activities has influenced my education.
That's fantastic, and I think it's a great degree. And of course, Patrick, Monica are both very inspiring individuals to work with. So I'm not surprised that you were
They are
encouraged to pursue that. That's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences, for doing the work that you do. I'm sure we'll be in touch again. Certainly, when we complete our next research in Malaysia, I will be in touch. Now, for the final 15 minutes or so, we will turn to the panel, the authors of the study, with some of the questions from the audience. And if you haven't done so already, please feel free to write your questions in the Q&A box, and we will select some of the questions that we have come in. So I will actually direct this first question to Monica, I think, and it's a question about the methodology and the importance of reflecting the voices from the children. Can you talk a little bit more about that? How you actually designed the methodology, how it worked out, how you implement it?
Sure. Thank you, Daniel, for this opportunity. And Catherine, I just wanted to say you are an inspiration to us as well. So our priority was to amplify the voices of youth and actually serve more as like a conduit rather than us deciding what should be said or what should be amplified, really lifting that up. And so part of how we did that was engaging youth facilitators in every country, working with them around the questions, working with local translators, working with them to identify different groups to speak with. We really wanted to talk to youth who had not been represented, marginalized youth whose voices are not often heard in the research. And so, of course, that proves challenging, and you really have to be comfortable with uncertainty as you arrive in a country and just trust the process and trust the just incredible people working with different populations, that the connections will happen, and sort of keep space available in your day and know that some of your days are going to be 16 hours because that will be the day that everybody can talk. And so yes, we did speak with marginalized youth. We spoke with refugee youth. We spoke with youth who were exploited in prostitution. We also spoke with youth from who are living in poverty, and we also spoke with children with disabilities. And so yes, we did try to amplify their voices in that way.
And just to follow up on that, Monica, so I'm going to come back to you because there's a related question to that, which is around children with disabilities and whether there were any policy recommendations or coming out for that group in particular, or whether you know of any such initiatives in general related to children with disabilities and policy development.
So actually, Patrick, did you want to jump in on that one?
Sure. Thanks, Monica, I think. So yeah, look, I mean, I think for me, there were a number of things, and they relate to both the policy and to actual intervention and program design. The first is clearly not to underestimate the importance of digital technology in children with disabilities' lives. I think it's also important not to underestimate the skills, the technical skills that some children with disabilities might have. You know, we sat in a room and I was speaking to children who are hearing impaired and visually impaired as two separate conversations. And you know, it was just absolutely phenomenal how active some of these children were online, creating music and uploading music. You know, the one child who played the guitar, had, I think, around 4,000 followers on his TikTok account. And he was showing me his TikTok account, and it was just, just videos and songs and music. And the skills in terms of, being able to navigate a lot of the disabilities or the challenges that the disability presents, there are ways around that. So I think for me, the first thing is to not underestimate the importance, to not underestimate the potential skills that these children would have. The other thing is to make sure that that the specific needs of children with disabilities are integrated into policy development. And I think, it's got to be integrated in a way that recognizes the potential, that doesn't view children with disabilities purely as potential victims. We know that children with disabilities, for example, are at greater risk of some forms of violence. We know that there's shared vulnerabilities between online and offline populations who are vulnerable, and so we need to take that into account. And we need to make sure that there are adequate and sufficient protection measures in place. But I think, when I've been involved in some policy development, often, it's kind of like children with disabilities, marginalized population, excluded populations, all get kind of, and plus the kitchen sink, kind of lumped together into this problematized category that policy needs to cater for. And I think that's hugely problematic. So I think it's recognizing the skills, the potential, the importance, but recognizing at the same time the specific vulnerabilities and making sure that children's voices inform that policy development. And from the onset, from initial consultations around policies to taking draft policy back to children, make sure children are part of that consultation process in developing your policy. And that really goes for children with disabilities as well. I should probably stop now.
Thank you so much, Patrick. That's really great to hear. And actually, a lot of what you say is something that UNICEF's country office in Albania also found in their study with children with disabilities. And I think that's an area of work actually that we need to expand. We need to understand more about the experiences of those children. While I have your attention now, Patrick, I have another question for you. And I one of the themes that you highlight in the report as cross-cutting were the restrictive responses by adults to perceived transgressions in children's technology use, which is driven more, I think, by parents' awareness or fears around online risks above the opportunities. I think this is something we see in many parts of the world. And it's something that we find in our research actually makes it much harder for some children to report negative experiences or seek help from adults because they're afraid of reprisal. How do you think we can turn this around? How do we build more open communication between parents and children around online risks and harms? I think it's something that Catherine also touched on. I would love to hear your ideas and thoughts on this, and Monica as well, if you have any.
I mean, I think it's one of the biggest challenges that we face, because I think it's an entire paradigm shift for many parents and caregivers. As people who are tasked with responsibility for taking care of children, and whose lives as parents and caregivers revolve around their kids in many instances, one wants to keep them safe. The best way to do that is the intuitive thing is to protect them, rather than looking at what the opportunities are, and sort of how you can engage more positively around this. So I think as long as there's a common narrative that's fear-driven and fear-based, I think we're going to be really battling. I think one has to recognize what all those risks are. One needs to say, these are we need to understand how risks impact in different ways for different people, and different types of risks impact different ways. And we need to start creating a thing where we say, look, there are these risks, we deal with them from the regulation and the control perspective on the one side, but underlying it all is a much more fundamental thing of how do you create the skills and the capacities to manage those risks. And it's about this kind of paradigm shift for children, for parents, and for adults. So I think there's that. I think what feeds into those fears and that kind of let's take away access, let's restrict access, let's control, let's monitor with monitoring software. What feeds into that is often parents feel disempowered in terms of their own digital skills and digital literacy, and this perception that children, their kids, know much more about this. Now, in many instances, that's absolutely true, but you've seen through some of the Global Kids Online studies, parents have this perception, but it's not necessarily true. I mean, we saw that in South Africa. And so I think it's also about trying to empower parents and caregivers beyond just what the technology kind of the perceived limits that technology places on it. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. No, it does make sense. And I have a follow-up on that, perhaps for Monica. One thing that interested me in the report, you talk about there's a prominent social media site that is used for people to contact boys in prostitution. And it's used to facilitate meetings with them where these children would be exploited or abused, which was a very powerful part of the report. Now, some people might say, this is a fault of the company, it's something they should work to address within their platforms. Others might say, well, the technology is just a tool, and the lives of these children may not fundamentally improve just because a company kicks abusers off their platforms. So could you talk to us a little bit about, what role does technology companies have in preventing sexual exploitation and abuse of children online, and which other actors need to be involved to also fundamentally support and protect children?
Thank you, Daniel. That's a really powerful set of questions there, because so first of all, the way that by default, the way most social media apps work is anyone can contact us. So right away, it devolves the responsibility to the user, and that means to the child user, to the youth user, to protect themselves against abusers, against people who criminally groom and abuse children online. And so right away, protecting children against that by switching what's the default and make privacy be the default. That's a start. Of course, that's not enough. We've already seen in articles in the New York Times that this major social media app platform, among others, are very aware that this abuse is happening, and there's not money in preventing it for the social media apps, and also acknowledging that it exists. I think tech companies often fear that would create negative press for them, so they ignore it. So taking a more proactive role is essential. There's always going to be abuse, and any tool, whether it's a phone, whether it's a camera, can be used for abuse. The problem is that social media allows that to scale and distribute globally and exponentially. And so that's where the real challenge lies. So as you mentioned, Daniel, there does need to be regulation. There needs to be more support at the local level. Children need safe spaces to be able to report things. So when we were talking earlier about the role of parents, if youth fear retribution from their parents, they're less likely to report. We spoke with teens in very posh schools as well, who had boyfriends or girlfriends threatening them and offering to pay them for images, and many of them didn't have safe spaces to talk to about these things. So there's definitely an immediate family level response. There's the local response, there's communal response, and legislative. But I do feel that technology companies need to take more responsibility.
I think that makes sense, and this is something we see in our upcoming disrupting harm research as well, around the reporting and things that impede reporting. I think are some of the areas where we really could do a lot more work. I'm going to do one last question. I'll leave it open, either of you who wants to respond. But there's a question about specific interventions with evidence of effectiveness in keeping children safe online. Does the report recommend any such interventions? I would add, are there any such interventions? What did you find out in these countries, and did you see any, or have you seen any potential programs that could keep children safe online, and that's actually backed by evaluations?
So I think the just measuring effectiveness could be another webinar conversation, and I think it has been. But I think that what we were seeing is really, I'm going to speak to the local level. So we spoke with different organizations that were working directly with youth on different issues. For example, the children exploited in prostitution, who we spoke with, were part of an outreach group in Bangkok that was providing a safe space for youth and providing other career opportunities, other skills training, a safe space to live, so that if they didn't have money to afford somewhere else to live, they still had somewhere to go. So I think that as far as effectiveness goes at our level, for me anyway, I felt that the local interventions, especially by Childline and the UNICEF country offices, were especially effective.
You want to give us 1 minute thought, Patrick, on
yeah,
this?
thanks. I mean, mine would just be to add to what Monica said, is that I think we do have a growing body of evidence around approaches that work, and I think that there's obviously now a lot more emphasis being put on measuring efficacy of interventions. But I would just say that without a doubt we need more evidence, and there are huge holes in the the huge evidence gaps. I think we are starting to see things around sort of risks and opportunities, but I just think that we should also be paying more attention to how some interventions that don't specifically target online safety are seeing outcomes, positive outcomes. And so when we have interventions that are being designed to start building in measures of online outcomes, and possibly vice versa as well. And the reason I'm saying, well, because we know there's that intersection, but also if you look at some cyberbullying, it's one area that's much more developed in terms of the evidence base. And there is more evidence around how offline bullying interventions that are effective can have positive outcomes for online bullying. You don't see the converse, but you do see it in terms of that directionality. And so we need to start looking at those kind of things. So that's just to add.
I think that makes absolute sense. And again, it brings in this overlap between online and offline environments that I think will be really important to explore in the future, and that we are exploring. We are exploring as UNICEF, you are exploring in your work. So we're on that, and we're moving forward, I think. With that, I will close this round of Q&A, and I will hand it over to Carrie for closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Gosh, I mean, what a fascinating discussion, and an absolute pleasure to listen to you all. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everybody's questions and answers. We could have easily talked another half an hour or more on this. So it just falls to me to remind you that the next Best of UNICEF Research and Evaluation 2020 Research Winner webinar will take place next week on Thursday, the 25th of March. It's on the topic of unaccompanied and separated migrant children on their transition to adulthood in Italy. For those UNICEF staff who are listening, a reminder that our BOR 2021 competition is open now, and it's accepting entries until the 31st of March. And finally, I want to end on a big thank you to all of our fantastic presenters and discussants, as well as to those behind the scenes helping with coordination to bring you this webinar who you're not seeing. So Emanuela, Christina, Claire, Celeste, Gerald, and George, I hope I haven't forgotten anyone. And lastly, thanks to all of you for tuning in, and we hope to see you all at our next webinar on the 25th. You can sign up via Twitter, and you can look out for the recording of this webinar on YouTube and on our Global Development Commons website. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your day.